Okay, so here we are. We're in week 6, and this week we're going to talk about the legislative process and the documents that are created during the legislative process. As you all know, last week we talked about statutes, and just sort of a quick high-level summary, we talked about the pattern for publication of statutes. At the federal level, each statute is first a bill. If the bill is passed, the statute's given a public or private law number, and it's published as a slip law. The number that's given to each slip law is derived from when the law was passed, so it's the session of Congress and then the chronological order in which each bill was passed. Slip laws are then arranged chronologically as session laws. At the federal level, these session laws are published as the statutes at large. And then after that, the codes are created. The Office of Law Revision Counsel, which is out of the House of Representatives, takes all the session laws of a general and permanent nature and arranges them by subject into a code. So that's statutes. Now let's talk about the path that bills actually follow before they become laws. And that path is referred to as the legislative process. We'll spend the rest of the class talking about this process and the documents that are created as bills become laws. Knowing about these documents and where they fit into the legislative process is important to legal researchers, both those who are creating legislative histories and also just anybody who wants to use the documents created during the legislative process to help interpret ambiguous or confusing language in enacted legislation or statutes. So, do you remember this character, the Schoolhouse Rock video? I know I saw it when I was a little kid watching cartoons on Saturday morning. I don't know if you all did. And if you didn't, you can watch it now. It goes all the way back to, I think it was created in the 1970s, but it's still a good introduction to the legislative process. So for fun, let's just take a look. It only lasts 3 minutes, and it might help to put the rest of what I say in this lecture and in class into context.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes! I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes!
Well, as you may have suspected, Bill makes it sound easier than it actually is. As many of you already know, the process of getting legislation passed in Congress is incredibly complex, and any individual bill can go down any kind of path with a lot of unanticipated twists and turns as it makes its way along to the president. Here, though, on this slide is a very stripped down version of the federal legislative process. First, a bill or a proposed legislation is introduced by a member of Congress, either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. The bill is numbered. House and Senate bills are numbered sequentially within a term of Congress. If the bill has not been passed by the end of the 2-year session, it must be reintroduced into the next session and it's assigned a new number. Second, the bill is referred to committee. It's a committee with jurisdiction over the subject matter of that bill. So a farm bill, for example, would be referred to the Agricultural Committee in the House and the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee in the Senate. Third, the committee or a subcommittee of that committee can choose to hold hearings on a bill. It doesn't always happen. For many bills, no hearings are held and the bill dies in committee, just like Bill told us. Fourth, the committee can mark up the bill and report it as amended to the full House or Senate. Fifth, the leadership of the Congressional chamber, whether it's started in the House or the Senate, decides whether or not to bring the bill to the floor of the chamber, so it might not even do that. If so, the bill can be debated and amended, and then the amended bill is then voted on by the entire membership of that chamber. A bill passed by one chamber of Congress is called an engrossed bill. Again, this is just so you know the term so we can find these documents in the legislative process. Sixth, the bill is referred to the other chamber of Congress, the one where it didn't start out, and it's immediately referred to the committee with jurisdiction. The same process occurs in the next chamber. Sometimes the referred chamber is already working on its own version of the bill, and then these competing bills can be passed back and forth between the chambers until they reach agreement. If the chambers can't agree, then a conference committee is scheduled where members of both chambers will hammer out compromise text. Seventh, the text of the legislation is prepared. That is called the enrolled version of the bill. And after being signed by officers of both the House and the Senate, the bill is presented to the president. Eighth, the president has 10 days to either sign or veto the bill. Ninth, the law becomes effective upon the president's signature unless specified otherwise. And then 10th, the Office of Federal Register assigns a public law number and publishes the new legislation as a slip law. So now we get back to what we were talking about last week. Okay, so that is the legislative process. Let's spend some more time talking about the various documents that are produced at each stage of this process. Because statutory language is often ambiguous, lawyers, judges, and legal scholars often try to determine congressional intent or to clarify confusing statutory language by studying the legislative history of the act or the legislative documents that were created during the enactment of the statute. To put it another way, legislative history is a term that refers to the documents that are produced by Congress as a bill is introduced, studied, and debated. For this video lecture, we'll talk about the different kinds of legislative history documents that are produced and how you might use them as a legal researcher. For the in-class portion of this lecture, I'll show you how to find these legislative history documents, and we'll do some exercises using Westlaw, Lexis, and the specialized databases where you can find legislative history documents. All right, so now that we've gone through the legislative process, we can talk a little more meaningfully about the documents that are produced along the way. All these documents together are what form an act's or a statute's legislative history. Here's a great diagram that shows a streamlined version of the legislative process and the documents that can be produced at each stage. Remember, each bill is going to follow its own individual path, and sometimes one particular kind of document will be produced and another time it won't. Once you understand the basic federal process, though, you can apply the same principles to the next bill that you look at, and you can even use these principles to do state legislative histories because the same kind of documents are produced in this state process of creating legislative acts as well. So now we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these type of documents in more detail. So the first important thing to realize is that all legislative history documents are not created equal. Each of them has varying degrees of usefulness, and this is sort of a good graphic so you can see from the bottom the documents that are considered to be less important, less authoritative, and less useful to creating legislative history and convincing judges of the meaning of a statute, to what is considered at the top the most important and most authoritative to convincing a judge about the meaning of an act. So conference and committee reports are usually considered to be the most important legislative documents. They contain more analysis than the other documents. Bills and floor debates may also be relevant. They can tell the intent of a particular chamber of Congress. The other legislative materials provide a little bit of information that might help you to determine legislative intent, although they often will only give a particular committee's version of what intent was, or they only give a perspective like in a hearing transcript of the person testifying. That being said, they often provide valuable background and factual information on the issue that's being addressed by the legislation. All right, so now let's go to where we're going to talk about each of the legislative documents in a little bit more detail so you know what they are and why you might use them. We'll talk about the documents in order of their appearance in the legislative process, not in order of importance as shown in the slide. So first up are bills. For the purposes of legislative history research, comparing various versions of a bill as it moves through the legislative process may help you to determine the intended meaning of the law. As I said, introduction of a bill into Congress is the first step of the formal legislative process. After a bill is introduced, it's assigned a bill number, printed, and referred to a committee. Bills are frequently amended throughout the legislative process, and they may be printed several times before they're finally passed. Comparing the various versions of a bill as it moves through the legislative process may help you to determine what Congress meant by the final version of the law. Arguments regarding the meaning of a statutory section may be drawn based on the inclusion, the deletion, or the modification of the language in the text of the final bill. So here's a bill that's from the current Congress. That's what it looks like. Next, we'll talk about committee hearings. House and Senate committees hear testimony on proposed legislation in order to determine the need for the legislation in a particular area. Also, they want to hear the views of various people or organizations that are interested in the legislation. Hearings can provide a wealth of information for background research into the issue Congress is addressing with respect to a particular piece of legislation. Hearings are held for almost all substantive legislation, and then transcripts of those hearings, including exhibits that were provided by those testifying, are published. For legislative history research, hearing transcripts are only of limited value, because hearings focus on the views of the parties testifying before Congress. They don't necessarily reflect the views of the committee or Congress as a whole. Here's two transcripts from hearings that you may have actually heard about on the news. Here's the first one. That's Mark Zuckerberg appearing before the Senate, and he's sort of outlining what he and his company plan to do about combating interference in U.S. elections. And here's Jon Stewart testifying before the House, talking about healthcare funding for 9/11 first responders. All right, so next up are committee and conference committee reports. Whereas committee hearing transcripts and committee prints are not particularly helpful when trying to determine legislative intent, congressional committee reports in general and conference reports in particular are probably the most important source of legislative history. Reports are issued for almost every bill that becomes law, and there's usually a report from each of the House and Senate committees that consider the legislation. So a report will actually accompany the bill when it's sent to the full chamber for debate and voting. Reports usually reprint the text of the bill, describe its purposes, and give reasons for the committee's recommendation on the bill. Often committee reports include the legislative history of the bill, the purposes of the bill, and what the committee regards as the need for the new legislation. Sometimes there's even a section-by-section analysis of the bill that's very helpful if your research is concentrated on just one section or a few sections. If a conference committee is appointed to draft a compromise bill accepted to both the House and the Senate, which as you know occurs when the House and Senate have different versions of the bill, a conference report is issued. And conference reports are particularly important because they come at the end of the legislative process and they report on the text of the compromise bill. Here's an example of a conference report. Okay, so there you can see it's a conference report regarding appropriations for national defense. And as you can imagine, that's a topic of much debate amongst Congress. So if you wanted to look at that report, there's the report number up on the top right. You can see it's from this session of Congress, and it's accompanying the bill H.R. 6157. So that's the House of Representatives bill number. All right, next up on our timeline of documents that are produced as a bill moves from being proposed to landing on the president's desk are transcripts of floor debates. And what are those? And I'm sure you've seen this on TV at some point or another, Congress debating the merits of a bill or an amendment. So congressional floor debates, the transcripts can contain explanations of provisions of bills that are vague or unclear. They can just be very useful for legislative history in determining congressional intent, because you can see actually what the members of Congress were discussing as they decided to go ahead and pass the bill, or not if you're researching a bill that ended up not being passed. The congressional record is where you would go if you wanted to get a transcript of legislative proceedings and debates on the floor of the House and Senate. But it's important to remember that the text of the debates in the congressional record is not necessarily a verbatim transcript. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's a summary. The congressional record is published in two editions, the daily edition and the bound edition. So the daily edition is published every day when Congress is in session. That's a lot of information, as you can imagine. The paper-bound daily edition has four distinct sections. There's the floor proceedings of the Senate, so everything that was going on the floor that particular day on the Senate, the floor proceedings of the House, a section called extension of remarks, and that's just written materials that members of the chamber can submit. They didn't get their chance to produce something on the floor. They want it put in the congressional record so they can submit it. And then the daily digest is the fourth section, which is a summary of floor and committee proceeding. All right, so that's the four sections of the Congressional Record Daily Edition. And then, as I mentioned, eventually comes out a permanent bound edition, which is a compilation of all of these various daily editions, but it is published very slowly. It's about 4 years behind the daily edition. So here's a page from the Congressional Record Daily Edition. You can just so you can see what these look like. All right, so the last piece of legislative history document that we're going to discuss is presidential signing statements. And obviously by the name you can tell this is not actually a legislative history document because it's produced by the president or the executive branch rather than the legislature. But in recent years it's become much more important to understand how these presidential signing statements work, to understand how legislation is being enforced. After all, legislation enforcement is handled by the executive branch. So what are they? They're written statements that are issued by the president when he is signing a bill into law. Commentators take issue with these signing statements because they say that they amount to a kind of line item veto, which were held to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1998. So you can see why they would be controversial. Just to give you a little bit, very brief background, sometimes presidents will say to the executive branch that they expect the new legislation to be enforced in a certain manner, whereas Congress could argue that that interpretation is at odds with the plain meaning of the legislation. And even more controversial, presidents have in the past actually expressed an intent not to enforce certain parts of legislation because the president is deeming that legislation to be unconstitutional. So, despite all of that controversy, all presidents since Ronald Reagan have had their share of these signing statements, and just so you can take a look at one of them, here is one from President Obama that was probably the most controversial of his term because it talks about Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. So that's it for the video lecture. That's a good background on the documents that are produced in the legislative process and how you might use them if you were interpreting statutes or doing a legislative history. As usual, when we get into class, we'll do a short exercise, and then I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate all the paid and free databases that you can use to find legislative history documents, and then we'll do a more complicated exercise towards the end where you can practice using these databases and finding these documents yourself. All right, I'll see you in class.